Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And the presentations that we've got today, we're going to have very brief presentations from a few different organisations, and then we'll have plenty of time hopefully for Q&As as well. And this is in fact, I don't even know how many webinars we've done, but this is certainly another, I think about our third one that we've had on the Plastics Treaty specifically. And it's great to see some familiar faces both speaking and also in the audience today. But hopefully you will learn a few new things because the negotiations are picking up pace as we enter the fourth round in Ottawa. And we have speakers from Fidra. So we have Jamie, who is sitting to my left, who works on the Great Nurdle Hunt project and has been following the developments in the Plastics Treaty. We'll then hear from Falco about what the negotiators need to know about pellets in the treaty, and he's joining us from Fauna and Flora and has been working on the marine plastics programme, particularly some of the international developments. We'll then have 5 minutes from Amy Youngman, who is the Legal and Policy Specialist at EIA, the Environmental Investigations Agency, and she'll be talking about tackling the treaty text, specifically Section 8, which is on pellets. And then we'll be joined by Andres del Castillo from CL, who will be talking about where else in the treaty pellets can be addressed. So what are the sections of the treaty? I'll try to keep us reasonably to time so that we have time for questions and answers. So apologies to the speakers if I try and cut in and just remind you that we want to also have time for discussions. I know that we all get very excited when we're talking about the treaty and how we can make it as good as it can possibly be, and many of us have had long discussions already about this. We'll try and keep today's a little bit briefer, but there will be more information available to everybody on these topics, both on the hub, the Fidra hub that we have for NGOs, and there's been joint briefings prepared on there. And there will also be a recording of this webinar. So if anything that you've missed or want to come back to at any point, because there is a lot of really useful information I know coming up in the presentations, you can go back to it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Jamie, who is going to talk to us about why pellets need to be in the treaty and some of the policy developments and pollution developments that have happened since INC4 and why it's even more pressing that we address pellets in the treaty, but perhaps even more possible as well. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Heather. Yes, so as Heather says, I'll be running us through what are pellets and their place in the Plastics Treaty. So, first of all, just for those unfamiliar with what are plastic pellets. So plastic pellets are microplastics, and they're approximately the size of a lentil. And they are the industrial feedstock used to produce almost all plastic products around the world. They're a major source of upstream plastic pollution and are the second largest source of primary plastic pollution globally. They can be produced from virgin plastics, from recycled plastics, and also from bioplastics. Now, these pellets enter the environment throughout the global plastic supply chain. These occur during the production of the nurdles themselves, during transportation, at factories where you're converting the pellets into plastic products, and also during the recycling waste phase, but also throughout the full supply chain wherever pellets are being handled. And this is the result of poor handling and mismanagement of the pellets and results in over 450,000 tons of plastic pellets spilling into the environment each year globally. And it's not just nations who produce pellets who can be impacted by this. Due to the global network that is the global plastic pellet supply chain, even nations who do not produce plastic pellets can still be impacted by pellet pollution, as can be seen by this infographic showing some of the key shipping routes going past many nations who don't have any pellet production. So really highlighting the fact that nowhere is safe from pellet pollution. But what are the impacts of plastic pellets? So first off, wildlife can mistake plastic pellets for food. Ingesting them, this leads to starvation and internal organ damage. As plastics break down in the environment, small fragments of plastic break off. These can then impact the human and animals, disrupting tissue functions. Also, plastic pellets are made of a cocktail of chemicals, and over time, these chemicals leach out the pellets into the environment with further detrimental impacts to human and animal health. Plastic pellets also act as a surface for the accumulation of toxic chemicals and bacteria, pathogens that are already in the environment, and over time these can accumulate on their surface. There's also the impact to communities and local economies as a result of plastic pellets, particularly fishing industries and tourism industries. So why do plastic pellets need to be in the treaty? First of all, plastic pellet pollution is a global issue, and the Great Global Nodal Hunt as a citizen science project that has helped to map pellet pollution around the world. And we've seen pellet pollution reported from Kenya to Canada, from Spain to Sri Lanka, and really highlighting the fact this is a global problem, along with the fact that the global plastic supply chain, as the name suggests, is global and requires a global response to global solutions to the problem. Industry and government initiatives to try to address this problem so far have not been effective. This is often due to the fact that they are either focused on a small part of the supply of the global plastic pellet supply chain, or they are voluntary measures in nature. And evidence from this can be seen in the continued plastic pellet pollution and the continued spills that we see of plastic pellets that are occurring. But this plastic pellet pollution is preventable with best practice implemented throughout the global plastic supply chain. Up to 95% of plastic pollution could be prevented. So a quick update on what has happened since the last rounds of talks at INC3. First of all, I'm sure many of you are aware that the revised Zero draft has been released, which has some important additions since the last Zero draft on plastic pellets, and will be important for these upcoming rounds of negotiations at INC4. At the International Maritime Organization, voluntary measures to prevent pellet loss during shipping have been voted through or approved. However, these are still only addressing a small part of the global plastic supply chain and are still voluntary. At the European Union, legislation has been moving through the EU system for addressing some sources of plastic pellet pollution in the European Union. However, again, this is just focusing on a small section of the global plastic supply chain. And unfortunately, we've also seen more spills in the months since INC3. This has included at least two derailments in the USA, which saw pellets coming from trains around that derailed in the North America, in the USA, sorry, as well as one that I'm sure many of you are aware of, which was the large spill of pellets off the Portuguese coast, which impacted the northern Spanish coastline, particularly Galicia, which saw millions of these plastic pellets washing up on the shore there as a result of containers being lost during a storm out at sea. So that is a brief summary of the plastic pellet issue and some of the key things that have happened since the last round of negotiations. For more information on all this, please check out our information hub, where we're uploading more resources and information on the Global Plastics Treaty as we're getting close to the event. Also follow us on social media to get those latest updates on all of those resources, and also follow us on YouTube, where we'll be uploading this webinar, and also our past webinars are available. So with that, I'll pass back to Heather.
Thanks, Jamie. I think that's given us a really good overview of why pellets are such a big pollution problem all over the world because of that global plastic supply chain, and also that there's pollution found everywhere. And it's really disappointing to see that there's been yet more spills, major spills, from train derailments and shipping, even just since the INC3 in November. And on top of that, there's that continual release of pellets every day from industry. But it is encouraging to hear that there are some moves to address both the international shipping at IMO and the continual release from sort of the everyday operations, potentially through new EU legislation. So I think that gives us a really good starting point and a really good momentum that we can build on as we go into the treaty text negotiations, which I'm now going to hand over to Amy to tell us a little bit more about what is in. Oh, sorry, I'm now going to hand over to Falco. I'm really sorry, Falco. I nearly missed you out because Falco is going to tell us a little bit more about what the negotiators need to know about pellets. So I'll hand over to Falco now to tell us more about what negotiators need to know about pellets at INC4.
Thanks a lot, Heather, and thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to try to share my screen, get my slides.
That looks great, Falco.
Can you see my slide properly?
Yeah, it looks fab.
Okay, perfect then. Yeah, well, thanks a lot for having me on the webinar today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll now dive in what negotiators need to know about plastic pellets in order to ensure that the UN Plastics Treaty efficiently tackle this pervasive but entirely preventable form of plastic pollution. So Jamie already went over this, but just wanted to give a brief overview of where we are with pellets. So they are the third largest source of microplastic pollution globally, as highlighted, with over 445,000 tons leaking out of the global plastic supply chain directly into the environment every year. And as Jamie highlighted previously, pellet pollution has huge impacts on biodiversity, but they also severely impact communities and economy around the world, including in countries that do not produce or use pellets. Ongoing pollution globally impacts the rights of communities to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and this situation must not be allowed to continue. So the Global Plastic Treaty presents an ideal opportunity to tackle this problem. Pellet pollution is a global issue, and it's not simply caused by unintentional losses to the environment. It is a result of supply chain-wide systemic failures to implement loss prevention measures. The problem is not new. Pellet pollution from land-based sources has been documented since the early 1970s, yet it has either been ignored or overlooked for years. A number of voluntary industry initiatives and schemes have attempted to address pellet pollution, such as the industry-led program Operation Clean Sweep, launched in the early 1990s. However, continuing pellet pollution shows these initiatives have been and are ineffective in addressing pellet pollution globally. This highlights yet and again that there is an urgent need for international legally binding regulation on pellets. Fortunately, the good news is that pellet pollution is entirely preventable. Studies have shown that sound pellet loss prevention measures that are maintained and monitored for effectiveness and adopted and implemented across all sectors could reduce pellet loss by 95%. The global scale of pellet pollution and the substantial evidence that pellet loss occurs at all stages of the plastics life cycle, from primary production to recycling, and at all stages of supply chains, including at industrial sites and during transport, means a global approach to preventing pellet loss is critical. The transboundary nature of pellet pollution and the involvement of multiple sectors and actors are further compelling reasons for the Global Plastic Treaty to tackle this source of plastic pollution and make it a thing of the past. So, if we focus on what negotiators must know to end pellet pollution, well, first of all, negotiators must know what pellets are. It's very important to understand what pellets are used for and what form they can take. Strong regulation on pellets starts with a strong definition of pellets. It's not always clear to everyone how pellets should be defined, and for this reason, we have drafted the following definition, which is adapted from the definition formally adopted by the International Maritime Organization and all 16 parties to the OSPAR Convention, including the European Union. All plastic pellets poses a threat to the environment, and therefore the definition of pellet must capture all types of plastic. When defining pellets, it is important to specify that pellets are used as feedstock for plastic manufacturing purposes. This is the identity of pellets, allowing us to characterize them. Furthermore, it is important to stress that pellets can be derived from primary, virgin polymer, and/or secondary polymer, such as recyclate, including bio-based polymers, which are produced from biomass, such as plants, for example. Last but not least, size limits should be avoided in the definition, because while pellets typically measure 5 millimeters or less, recyclate flakes, which are secondary polymers used as feedstock, can be bigger than 5 millimeters, as we try to illustrate on the picture in the lower right. We therefore recommend negotiators to adopt this proposed definition for pellets, which can also be accessed in our latest joint primer that will soon be available on our Global Plastic Treaty webpage, which I've included a link to on the slides. So, as mentioned earlier, pellet loss prevention measures, if well implemented, could reduce pellet loss by 95%. The treaty is well placed to provide an overarching framework for coordinated international actions at all stages of the pellet supply chain, covering all pellet handlers, carriers, and installation types. This would ensure consistency, transparency, and measurable continuity in practices. Pellets are currently being looked within Provision 8 of the revised Zero Draft, and it is imperative to retain specific language pertaining to pellet loss prevention within this provision. Whereas other sources of plastic pollution can be addressed through targeted intervention in product design or sectoral measures, pellet pollution necessitates a standalone provision. I won't go too deep in the content of the provision, as I know that my colleague Amy will be providing further insight on this, but I thought it would be useful to summarize some of the main elements that negotiators must take into account with regards to pellet and Provision 8 ahead of the next round of negotiations. First of all, an obligation on parties to prevent pellet loss in Provision 8 creates an opportunity to establish a level playing field. It will lead to all companies, regardless of size or location, across the full plastic life cycle that produce, handle, transport, store, or process plastic pellets, having to implement and maintain effective loss prevention measures that meet verifiable, mandatory minimum requirements based on internationally standardized measures for pellet handling, packaging, and transport. The treaty, with dedicated language on pellets, can ensure that every individual company or sector is behaving responsibly. Once pellet enters the environment, they are highly mobile and very difficult to clean up. Standardized, ecologically sensitive protocols to clean up pellets at the source are essential to limit further dispersion into the environment, and efforts to clean up existing sites of pellet pollution and accumulation must take into account the local environment and ecological sensitivities to avoid potential negative impact. Furthermore, the treaty must outline transparent reporting mechanisms for quantities of pellet produced, handled, imported, exported, and lost, alongside mechanisms for accountability in the case of historic, future, and ongoing pellet loss, with equitable access to compensation and remediation of for those impacted. It is crucial that all companies that handle plastic pellets are legally required to provide independent, third-party verification that pellet loss prevention measures are implemented, maintained, and monitored for effectiveness at every stage of supply chain. Through these measures and others, the treaty would set an effective global framework to tackle pellet pollution and complement other maritime and terrestrial policy developments. Now, if we look at how the treaty can complement other efforts to tackle pellet loss, well, first of all, it is important to highlight that there is currently no global requirement to prevent pellet loss, and this must change. Policies to prevent pellet loss and spills are under development in certain jurisdictions and for certain contexts, such as those of the International Maritime Organization and of the European Union. But clearly, these do not have the global reach or cover the whole supply chain. So far, recommendations adopted at the IMO are specific to the carriage of plastic pellets by freight container at sea and are voluntary. The International Maritime Organization progress towards mandatory regulation is not expected to result in legally binding regulations for shipping of pellets for several years, and will not address most pellet loss which occurs on land, emphasizing the necessity for the treaty to regulate pellets at the global level. The proposed EU regulation on its side is regional governance. And while some nations in the North Atlantic have committed to comprehensive action on pellets via the OSPAR Convention, further work is needed to ensure pellets are addressed globally and ensure commitments are translated into national legislation, regulation, and administrative measures to address pellet pollution. So while commitments to tackle pellet loss are being developed, the treaty must ensure that there is a harmonized and global approach on pellet loss prevention by ensuring consistency, transparency, and best practices across all sites, modes of transportation, and countries party to the treaty. While parties can learn from existing governance or practices, deferral to other instruments or initiatives risk uncertainty and fragmented governance. Addressing this pollution in the treaty through a specific obligation under Provision 8 ensures dedicated governance specifically tailored to address the holistic life cycle of plastic pellets, from production to proper disposal, facilitating clearer accountability and more robust implementation, signaling a unified commitment to combating this source of plastic pollution globally. Well, this is it for me. Thanks very much for letting me outline the impact of pellet pollution and providing, I hope, some useful insights that negotiators should consider ahead of INC4. Please don't hesitate to get in touch or visit our Plastic Treaty webpage if you'd like to get further recommendation with regards to pellets in Provision 8. I will now hand over back to Heather and Amy, who's going to offer a deeper dive into the pellet language in the treaty.
Great, thank you, Falco. I think that's given us all a lot to think about and what negotiators really need to know as they're entering into INC4. So I should warn everyone, we do have some lawyers coming up. We've got attorneys who are going to get stuck into the treaty text. This is the bit that some of you have really been waiting for, and for the rest of us, we all need their insights to hold our hands about what words are the best words to use to get the best possible treaty. So we're going to have a closer look at the treaty text now with Amy Youngman from EIA, and I'll hand over to you, Amy, to talk us through what's in the treaty and how it can be as strong as possible.
Thanks, Heather. Can you see my screen?
We can. It looks great.
Great. Thank you. So first, thank you to Fidra for inviting me to speak again. It's great to be back. My name is Amy Youngman. I'm a lawyer and a legal and policy specialist for the Environmental Investigation Agency. And EIA primarily works on the Global Plastic Treaty. However, I also have been very busy with pellets because I work in the International Maritime Organization. And also I'm working on the EU proposal for a regulation on plastic pellet loss. So it's been a busy few months, but it's exciting to see things moving on pellets. Today, Fidra asked me to speak about pellets in the Global Plastic Treaty Revised Zero Draft Text. The Revised Zero Draft Text, Part 2.8, covers emissions and releases of plastic throughout its life cycle. And we find in paragraph 2 a dedicated subprovision that aims for parties to take measures to prevent and eliminate the loss of plastic pellets into the environment. I'm sorry for a lot of text. As Heather mentioned, it's going to be quite text heavy, but I hope that I won't make you all read too much. And this text with brackets may be a little bit daunting. So before I kind of dig into the text, I just wanted to address the alternative options, which you can see here highlighted in yellow. So the first alternative is to have no text, and the second alternative is to have pellets go into Annex B. Annex B is a list of problematic and avoidable plastic products, including short-lived and single-use plastic products and intentionally added microplastics. I think that Falco and Jamie did a great job of introducing the problem, but I want to reiterate why pellets are a unique source of plastic pollution that deserve their own sub-provision, so why we shouldn't opt for these alternative options. And again, pellets are not just a microplastic or a pollution. They're really the product itself. They're the feedstock that creates almost all plastic products. So regardless of whether or not we reduce the production of virgin pellets, we will always have pellets. And if we do reduce virgin pellets, we will hopefully increase the use of non-toxic recyclate pellets or safer bio-based pellets. Thus, this isn't just an issue about production, but more about the international nature of plastic manufacturing, which includes those secondary markets. The inclusion of pellets in Annex B is simply a technical misunderstanding of what a pellet is, and the real reason why pellets deserve to be retained is because the majority of losses into the environment occur from human error, improper handling, and of course the lack of preventative measures in place. We know that there is a straightforward solution that is cost-effective and requires absolutely no changes to product or consumer behavior. And we've heard from Jamie and Falco about the damage once they're in the environment, so why we should kind of specifically have a sub-provision for them. All right. So now we can take a clean look at the version of the text that EIA recommends using as a basis for negotiations. And this is going to be found in part 2.8, option 2, paragraph 2. The yellow highlighted text is new text introduced after the original zero draft text, which we spoke about ahead of INC3. This definitely strengthens the text by including reference to the supply chain and making sure that this is a non-exhaustive list. However, you'll notice that not all aspects of the supply chain are included in the underlined text. So one way to strengthen this, as an example, would be to add conversion, waste management, and recycling to that underlined section. And similar to my recommendations last year or last session, we also have the blue highlighted text calling out the IMO specifically. And while this text is quite boilerplate in international treaty negotiations, I think that it's best to either delete this reference because it kind of creates confusion, implying again that for the people that aren't pellet nerds and don't know what's going on every day in pellets, that the IMO has some sort of handle on pellets, when in fact we know that they have adopted this voluntary guidance and we're very happy about that, but that's specifically related to plastic pellets carried by freight container at sea. And again, when we're talking about plastic pellets, we really want to ensure governance across the entire life cycle of the product and the supply chain. So it'd be my recommendation to delete reference to that, or as an alternative to include OSPAR, which also has voluntary recommendations. And again, this is a fine basis, but looking at the last 50 years of best practices, we can go beyond this and really address the problem in a more meaningful way without being so prescriptive that countries struggle to implement these measures. This might look quite similar. It's good. Fauna and Flora and Fidra and EIA and CL are all on the same page about our recommendations, I think. So this is a bit iterative, but just a few more recommendations in addition to kind of retaining the text as option 2 reads and making those textual amendments to strengthen it that I already kind of mentioned in the last slide. So there are certain minimum mandatory requirements on prevention, containment, and cleanup measures that exist in domestic legislation. And these will come soon also to regional legislation through the European Union and voluntary guidance, of course, in OSPAR and IMO. There's also legislation being developed in the United States. And if we create these minimum requirements for each installation and carrier type, we could include those in Annex E related to other sources that would be addressed by Part 2.8 in the treaty. What's really critical is establishing more transparency and an understanding of what the supply chain includes. Right now, we have a very fragmented approach that's kind of owned by industry, and they don't always tend to be the most transparent with their information. So what's really necessary is to increase transparency itself and to monitor whether the efforts that we're making with those mandatory minimum measures are effective. And we can only do that with data. So incorporating the mandatory harmonized reporting methods, which are also listed in Part 2.13 of the zero draft text, and incorporating kind of the recommendations that Falco also mentioned in that transparency database would be critical. And then in addition to transparency on quantities, we should also have transparency on the implementation of these measures for parties, which will help us to evaluate those mandatory minimum measures, as well as hold parties accountable to make sure that we avoid what we have now, which is for the last 30 years having these loose voluntary measures without third-party verification, which continues to allow pellet spills to go and occur unabated despite having kind of these voluntary best practices. So those would be my recommendations for textual strengthening, and I thank you for having me. I also would encourage everyone to sign the petition to strengthen our EU legislation. One little push there, and I'll pass it off back to Heather. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. It's good to see that there are pellets still in the revised zero draft, and there are still options to make sure it's as strong as it can possibly be. So thank you for your insights on that. We're now going to move on to hear from Andres de Castillo, who is a senior attorney at SEAL, and he's going to be talking us through some of the other areas in the treaty that could help address pellet pollution. So outside of just Section 8, there's a whole other treaty out there, and there are different parts of that can be used to address pellet pollution as well. So Andres, are you able to share your slides?
Hello, everybody. I will try quickly to do it. Otherwise,
Yeah, we can step in if not.
yeah, yes, it seems that I'm able. Can you see Shakira? Cover of the new album.
Oh, there we are.
Yes, we can see Shakira. That's not what I was expecting in a treaty discussion. It's always nice to see her. Fantastic. Thank you, Andres.
Yeah, it's big enough, or
Yeah.
Okay. Let me make sure that you can see the full screen, and I will try to make sure that lawyers also can do things that are attractive to general public, but in general also for negotiators that not necessarily all of them are lawyers, but then wanted to make some links between, you know, the narrative or what we call things. There are different names there, you know, Mermaid Tears. We see the new album of Shakira, you know, where, you know, she's crying diamonds, but let's think that is Mermaid Tears made with plastics and with different kind of feedstocks, right? And during the previous speakers, they mentioned sometimes like defining, you know, plastic pellets. Even we say like are microplastics, but not or not. You know, this is a valid question too. So I want to point out two specific points. The first is
Sorry,
the
Andrew,
question.
Sorry, your slides still aren't loading. I don't know whether you can
Okay.
go back to the last screen.
Yeah, can you do it?
Yeah.
Can you share your screen instead?
Yeah,
So
we'll share
that will be
instead.
better. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just let us know when you want us to move on the slides. So we'll get Shakira up and then.
Yeah, if you can share this, the presentation will be perfect.
That come up?
Exactly.
No.
Great.
Great. So we can go
There we are.
directly to the second slide, where mainly first is a question of definitions, and I want to reiterate the OECD definition from 2022, what it means plastic pollution in the context of the life cycle, because that will give us an idea of, you know, that broadly all emissions and risk resulting from plastic production, use, waste management, and leakage. And we need to apply this definition also to pellets, and to understand that not only under one specific obligation or sub-obligation, we can include the issue of pellets, but take that into consideration when we are addressing other topics. I'm gonna focus more on the upstream, but here you can see in one of the videos of Shakira that she's always contributing and showing the problem of plastic pollution, and we see plastic products there, you know, but what we don't see is what they are made from, right? And we understand that pellets are, and plastic polymers are pollutants themselves, and plastic pellets is the way or the form or how polymers enter into the market, right? So we see that obligation number one is very relevant, and we can pass to the next slide, please. And but also to give you an overall of, I was trying to look at the, you know, the table of content of the review version of the zero draft, and maybe I can say that in all of those provisions we can think that there is some relationship with plastic pellets, right? You can see the different line in red, but since the preamble we see a recognition that plastic pollution is a problem, including microplastics. So that put us also, that raise another question, whether when we talk about microplastics within the text, where you can find, if you do a Control F, you find more than 80 references on microplastics, right? But if you do the same Control F for plastic pellets, you will find only 5 and mainly concentrated on obligation 8. The question is whether, when we mention microplastic, we are referring that to pellets too, or we will need to include within the text microplastics, including pellets at some point or not, right? This is more a question of technique of what we want to have or not. And from both options, there are advantage and disadvantage, right? To have pellets mentioned is very specific, but what happened that can lead also to confusion when we talk about microplastics or plastic polymers itself. So, but here you can see again that in different parts of the life cycle of plastics, we can see a reference to or some relevance to pellets. As Amy was saying, we need to make sure that there's no loopholes and that plastic pellets are also considered under the lens of a full life cycle. For instance, during waste management, if we work on recycling, complex or industries can also be a specific source of plastic pellet pollution at some point, right? So, and it's linked to a different kind of obligation than obligation number 8 that will be more generic. So next slide, please. And here, to keep making very sexy, cleanups sound very sexy, but they're very, very difficult in case of pellets. And as the message from my previous panelists were very important, prevention and best available techniques are very, very, very relevant in case of plastic pellets. But most important part is to highlight that more production of plastics means more plastic pellets into the environment, and this is a fact. And next slide, please. Then on obligation number 1, plastic polymer production, I want to mention that during the polymerization phase and the plastic material phase, we will find the pellets thing, but we need to make sure that this obligation number 1 keep something that we call the chapeau, that is the overall obligation, to make sure that there are some safeguards on environmental dimensions and also on health dimension for the production of primary plastic polymers. So with those safeguards, we can kind of include some specific parts related to when there is a specific factory producing the polymers, and this commercial way of polymer that are the concretization called pellets that are dealt at the best way that they can, because as you say before, this is something that is preventable, the releases and emissions of plastic pellets into the environment. Next slide, please. So then 3 specific messages. The first is that the plastic, when we talk about the term plastic polymers, sometimes it's equal to polymers in plastic forms or on primary forms, or primary plastic polymers themselves. That describes polymer that have not been used or processed before, and that are manufactured directly from both fossil and bio-based feedstocks. So then the second message is plastic polymers emerge from the factory in various forms, predominantly. This is what is important to say: plastic pellets, powders, and flakes, to sometimes fibers, paste, and liquids. But in the case of flakes, sometimes we are talking of something that is more than 5 millimeters. So that maybe if there is a definition of what is microplastic, that can be out of the scope of what is microplastic in the case of some pellets, right? So we need to make sure that there is no loopholes in that area, or that the companies are used putting the pellets in another more than 5 millimeters. So it's out of the scope because it's not microplastics. Then third kind of takeaway is also that pellets can be manufactured from primary plastic polymers, but also from recycled resins, or the combination of both. And this is very important to have in mind whenever we want to tackle these crises that also include the plastic pellets into the environment. Next slide, please. Then for this, I want to promote three relevant reports that we have. The first is an analysis of the review zero draft that includes some specific comments on different provisions, and a full publication that is short, is less than 20 pages, on plastic polymers within the scope of the full life cycle of plastics. And finally, a compilation of definitions that includes some definitions on microplastic that sometimes includes a reference to pellets too. So with that, I want to end the presentation. Happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andres. That was great. So I think that's a useful step back over the treaty, and we've talked a lot about how pellets are such a big problem globally that we have to manage them to prevent loss. But I think that was a useful reminder that we also need less pellets overall, so that there's less pellets going into the environment, and that we need safer pellets. So pellets without the harmful chemicals in, recycle it without the harmful chemicals in. And again, another call for having really strict definitions that can't be wriggled out of. And it's also been really interesting to hear about how we need to consider pellets when we're thinking about cleanup and doing, when all else fails, and if the prevention hasn't worked, as it hasn't been doing recently, that when cleanup is needed, that is responsible and ecologically sensitive. So I think there's a lot to think about in a lot of sections of the treaty, as well as section 8 as well. So it's been really interesting to hear all of the panel's insights into that.